The tranquil community of Boonesboro, Virginia, was shaken to its core on April 3, 1985, when the bodies of Derek and Nancy Haysom were discovered in their cottage-style home. After an exhaustive investigation that led nowhere, authorities would end up finding answers much closer to home than they expected. Just as investigators thought they had solved the gruesome crime, their main suspects disappeared. This is Monsters. On April 3, 1985, a group of ladies were standing on the front porch of a home near Lynchburg, Virginia. They had all come to the home of Derek and Nancy Haysom to play bridge after church, but nobody was answering the door. Both of their cars were in the driveway, and it was unlike Derek to miss a game, especially when it was happening at his own house. They called a friend who had been given a spare key just in case of emergencies, and when she showed up, she unlocked the door and swung it open. Right there on the floor was Derek, covered in blood. The woman quickly closed the door and locked it. She told the other ladies that they needed to call the police. They all climbed into the same car and drove a few minutes down the street to a store where they were able to make the call. It wasn't long before a deputy from the Bedford County Sheriff's Office was on the scene. The ladies had driven back to the house and were awaiting his arrival. The deputy entered the house and, of course, saw Derek on the floor as he was right inside. Once he confirmed that there was a dead body in the house, he also backed out and called for backup. As soon as another deputy was on the scene, they entered the house together and searched the entire premises. It wasn't until they entered the kitchen that they found Nancy laying on the linoleum floor in a pool of blood. After finding both residents and clearing the rest of the rooms, the deputies exited the house and it became an active crime scene. The initial examination of the bodies showed that they had both had their throats slashed. Derek had a number of stab and slash wounds around his neck and face, which looked like the killer's first few attempts at slicing the victim's throat. He also had defensive wounds, including some on his palms that looked like he had grabbed the knife blade directly. Besides having every artery in his neck severed, he also had been stabbed in the heart. Then he had been stabbed and slashed at least 24 times on his chest and back. Derek had been killed in an absolutely brutal frenzy. Nancy also had a stab wound to the heart on top of a slash to the throat. The initial examination of the crime scene revealed several puzzling elements. There were no signs of forced entry, indicating that the perpetrator might have been known to the victims. The exterior lights of the house were on, but the interior remained dark. Investigators discovered 4 types of blood and bloody shoe prints throughout the house. Traces of blood were found in various locations, including the bathroom, suggesting a frantic attempt by the killer or killers to clean up after the attack. Curiously, valuables in plain sight, including silverware, cash, and jewelry, remained untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. The crime scene yielded 4 sets of unidentified fingerprints. Investigators found 3 chairs pulled out from the dining room table, which reinforced their idea that they knew their attacker. The blood, which some estimated covered 90% of the dining room and kitchen floors, led the investigators to believe that the attack began in the dining room. Nancy retreated to the kitchen where she fell to the floor. At the same time, Derek was struggling with the attacker. Once the assailant was able to dispatch Derek, he went into the kitchen and sliced Nancy's throat. Investigators would need to start looking into who might want to kill the Haysoms. Derek Haysom was born in 1913 in South Africa. He grew up on his father's sugarcane farm, a venture that made the Haysoms considerable wealth. He earned a degree in engineering from Howard College in the coastal city of Durban. Then, like many wealthy young men at the time, he moved to England. He worked for an engineering firm in Manchester while taking night classes to earn a degree in electrical engineering. Right after he earned his second degree, he joined the British Army and served in World War II, working in intelligence. At some point, Derek married a woman who was originally from New Zealand, and they had 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter. But they eventually got divorced and she moved back to her home country. Not much else is known about the woman or their marriage. The children were left for Derek to raise alone, which he did. They eventually returned to South Africa where Derek would meet Nancy. Nancy Benedict was born on July 12, 1932 in Jerome, Arizona. Her father, Platt Benedict, was a geologist who helped locate resources for miners. The area was rich in gold, silver, copper, and gypsum. Nancy's mother, also Nancy, was from a well-to-do family in Virginia, so she was always longing to get back to the Blue Ridge area. Once Platt was finished working in Arizona, he moved the family to the Yukon Territory in Canada. When Platt decided to follow the gold to Alaska, Nancy Sr. wasn't interested and she moved with the children back to Virginia. There, Nancy did well in school and participated in ballet lessons and acted in her school theater. In 1949, when Nancy was 17 years old, Platt began working in South Africa and his family joined him there. That was where Nancy met and married a man named Ian Hall. Her parents were opposed to the relationship, so they refused to attend her wedding. After having 2 sons together, it seemed that Nancy realized her parents were right about Ian and she divorced him. From there, she raised her children alone while making a decent living investing in South African gold futures. Nancy met Derek in 1959 when she was 27 years old and Derek was 46. The age gap wasn't a problem for Nancy because she was looking for someone more mature than her ex-husband. They quickly married and relocated to Salisbury, Southern Rhodesia, which is now Harare, Zimbabwe. There, Derek took a job managing a British-owned steel mill. Elizabeth Haysom was born on April 15, 1964 in Salisbury, the only child of Derek and Nancy together. She became the 6th child living in the home. Southern Rhodesia was starting to fight for their independence, and it was causing problems for Derek having a management position working for a British company. It was government policy to repress black workers, only promoting whites, but Derek promoted who he saw most fit, and since the population of the country was 95% black, that's where the promotion often went. When Derek didn't change his practices after a scolding, he was eventually put on house arrest. Seeing the country as not being a safe place for himself and his family, they fled, relocating to Luxembourg before being offered an executive position at Sydney Steel in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. They were eventually given Canadian citizenship and lived there for the following 16 years. Elizabeth wasn't in Canada that whole time, though. She attended St. George's International School in Montreux, Switzerland, before being moved to Riddlesworth Hall Preparatory School in Norfolk, England. That was the same school that Princess Diana attended, which was impressive enough, but then she moved to Wickham Abbey in Buckinghamshire. That was a private girls' school that was highly esteemed, which was something that would become very important to Elizabeth. Anything that would make her stand out as being more elevated than others were major points of conversation with her. She would always ensure anyone around her knew where she had traveled, where she had attended school, and of course, that she was related to Lady Astor, the first female member of British Parliament. Wow, how impressive. What was impressive was Elizabeth's performance in school. Academically, she made grades considered higher than an American A in all subjects. She also excelled at sports and won championships in debate. She was most interested in history and intended to pursue that in college, but her parents were pushing her to become an engineer, like Derek. Despite her not wanting to go down that path, for her senior year they enrolled her in a series of high-level math and science classes at Wickham without her knowledge. She was unable to maintain her grades, and by the time her parents finally agreed to let her return to the history track, it was too late. She would have to repeat her senior year. On top of that being an extra year at the school, all of her friends were graduating and moving on. During the summer before Elizabeth's second senior year, she claimed that she was framed for drug possession and punished by school officials. Part of that punishment was that she wasn't allowed to contact her parents. During police interviews, she said she flipped out over the punishment and left the school. She claimed she went to France where she worked as a researcher for a law firm and then traveled to Germany where she worked for IBM. It was true that she had left the school and traveled in Europe, but in France she was reported as having had a few menial jobs that barely made her enough to survive, and in Germany she didn't have a job. She lived with a group of young men who provided her with drugs and used her body as they pleased. According to her, she hit her head, in one story by tripping and falling down some stairs, and in another story by being thrown down an elevator shaft. She claimed to be so concerned about the head injury that she turned herself in and was returned to England. In her final year, Elizabeth became rebellious, not maintaining her grades and even cutting her hair short, something that good girls did not do at the time. She stopped hiding her drug use as well and was officially expelled from the school, but the officials allowed her to stay in order to take her final exams. That black mark on her record meant she wouldn't be able to attend Cambridge, which was her plan. Elizabeth had made one friend during her second year at Wickham, one of the few other troublemakers in the school. After her friend's application to Oxford was rejected, the girls decided to run away. They made arrangements at a travel agency to go to Berlin, but that was only to throw off anyone who might come looking for them. They really went to Paris, which was the start of 4 months of traveling around taking odd jobs to get by. They spent most of their time in various parts of France, but they did hit Germany, Luxembourg, and Italy during their time on the lam. On October 25, 1983, the two girls showed up at the British consulate in Berlin and asked for train tickets back to England. Elizabeth was emaciated and pale. She had her hair shaved into a pink mohawk, which made a nasty-looking gash on her head visible. Derek and Nancy had moved to Bedford County, Virginia, to be closer to Nancy's family by the time Elizabeth returned home. Elizabeth would end up attending the University of Virginia, and that would be where she would meet a fellow student named Jens. Jens Soering was born on August 1, 1966 in Bangkok, Thailand, to Klaus and Anne Claire Soering. Klaus worked at the German consulate in Bangkok for the first year of Jens' life before being transferred to Cyprus. There, Jens' brother Kai was born. In 1972, the Soering family returned to Germany so Klaus could work directly at the Foreign Services headquarters. In 1977, when Jens was 11 years old, Klaus was sent to the German consulate in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. Jens and Kai attended a private school just down the street from their house, and like Elizabeth, Jens was academically gifted. Though he had the benefit of high intelligence, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else didn't win him many friends. He was described as argumentative, arrogant, and patronizing. Despite that, he was a member of many clubs, including the German chapter of the Foreign Language Club, the Guitar Club, and the Photography Club. He was also involved in drama, though he was more interested in the work behind the scenes as opposed to doing any acting. In his senior year, he directed a horror movie with other students. When he graduated, he enrolled at the University of Virginia, having been awarded a spot as both an Eccles Scholar and a Jefferson Scholar. Only students with perfect SAT scores are placed in the Jefferson Scholar program. It was Jens' admission to the Eccles Scholar program that led him to meet Elizabeth, though. All of the Eccles Scholars were housed in the same dorm, and in August of 1984, Elizabeth, who was also an Eccles Scholar, met Jens while they were moving into the dorm. That was where she met Jens, but they didn't actually start getting to know each other until November. Elizabeth would admit that she wasn't immediately attracted to Jens, but once they got to talking, she found his foreignness irresistible. Having spent so much of her life outside of the U.S., she prided herself on being different from Americans. She viewed her European experience as making her more sophisticated than most of the people around her. She saw the same in Jens, which drew her toward him. The more they got to know each other, the closer they grew, looking down on Americans together. That said, once the two began dating, people who knew them said that Jens became much more tolerable, and some said that he was less arrogant. He had initially intended to major in psychology, but he eventually changed his major to film and screenwriting. Getting to know each other included talking about their pasts. Jens told Elizabeth how abusive his rigid father was. It drove his mother to drink and fall into depression. Elizabeth began telling Jens about her life, and she included stories of the abuse she had suffered at the hands of her parents. There are a number of versions of why and how Derek and Nancy Haysom were killed, and at the end of the day, only Elizabeth and Jens know the truth, but this version includes Elizabeth convincing Jens to kill her parents by making them seem like they were abusive. She told Jens that her mother had forced her to strip naked and took explicit pictures of her that she shared with other people. She told him that her mother's friends who had seen the pictures had confronted her about them and laughed at her. She supposedly showed the pictures to Jens and told him that her father knew about it and didn't care. It's also believed that she told Jens that her mother had sexually assaulted her other times. That revelation allegedly prompted Jens to proclaim that he would kill them. But Elizabeth would later claim in court that her mother had never sexually abused her. Most people believe that it was a lie in order to enrage Jens enough that he would kill her parents. Outside of that, Elizabeth had long resented her parents and quickly began suggesting that her and Jens's lives would be better if they were dead. She told him that they didn't approve of them being together and that they had talked of sending her away as a means of splitting them up. Again, it's impossible to know what was true and what wasn't, as it became clear to everyone around her that Elizabeth was a pathological liar. Prior to the murder, Elizabeth told a string of lies to Jens, including that she had been gifted a house by her cousin in England, but that she could only get it if she attended Cambridge. Of course, she told him that it was her parents that were keeping her from attending Cambridge, not the truth, which was that she had been expelled from Wickham Abbey. To tell the truth, Derek and Nancy were not big fans of Jens. They did believe that their daughter could do better. So it wasn't long before the couple believed that their only option would be to kill Derek and Nancy. Then they would be free to be together, living off the inheritance she would receive. Elizabeth had told Jens that if her parents died, she would be wealthy. Then she promised that she would pay for his brother's college education with that money. Not only that, but they would be free to travel together like he had dreamed, something that her parents were supposedly not allowing her to do. Crime scene techs had scoured the Haysom residence with every piece of investigative technology they had. They pulled out pieces of linoleum from the floor. They lifted fingerprints. They took blood samples. They found several cigarette butts and a hair that did not belong to either Derek or Nancy in the bathroom. Most importantly, they found a footprint in blood on the floor. The footprint had been made wearing a sock and was detailed enough that it would make a good comparison to the suspect. All they needed now was a suspect. The autopsy showed that both Derek and Nancy had been dead for 3 to 4 days by the time they had been found. That meant that they had been murdered sometime on the previous weekend of March 30th and 31st. One of the other items found in the house was a handful of nude pictures of Elizabeth. They were in an upstairs art studio used by Nancy where there was an incomplete nude portrait she had been working on. All of the pictures were taken from an angle where her front wasn't clearly visible, and Elizabeth would later tell investigators that she had willingly taken the photos for her mother to use as art references. She admitted that Nancy had not shared them with anyone else. After learning as much as they could about the Haysoms, investigators were ready to talk to the only child they had living near them at the time. Their 5 older children were spread around North America, most in Canada, but Howard was working as a surgeon in Houston, Texas. Elizabeth was the closest at the University of Virginia, about an hour away in Charlottesville. It was 5 days before the investigation team would end up finally meeting the Haysoms' youngest child. When she showed up for her interview, they were shocked when they heard her British accent. The interview went on for hours as Elizabeth tended to ramble on quite extensively. That also seemed to be a technique she used to avoid answering questions. The detective would ask, then she would go on and on about various topics related to the question, but she would never offer a complete answer. When they asked her if there was anyone who wanted to hurt her parents, she claimed that her father had made some enemies in Nova Scotia. She claimed that he had invented some process to make steel more easily, and he began getting threats from the local steel union. She also claimed that she was assaulted at school due to the backlash regarding her father. Someone had attacked her, hit her in the face, and knocked out her teeth. It was true that she had suffered an injury at the time, but there was no confirmation that anyone had attacked her. She claimed that that was why her parents sent her to study abroad, but that would mean the incident had happened decades ago. Would someone travel to Virginia to kill Derek over it now? It seemed unlikely. Investigators also asked about her parents' finances, and Elizabeth displayed her belief that her parents had more money than they did. They did own their home in Virginia, and she said they still owned their home in Canada. She also claimed they were looking into purchasing another home in North Carolina, which they were planning to pay mostly cash for. She told the detective that they weren't, quote, very, very wealthy, but she said they were living very comfortably. In reality, investigators would find that the Haysoms were worth about $175,000, which would be about $500,000 today. Not a small amount of money, but not a lot after it was split up between 6 children. Though she wasn't initially a suspect, she did offer an alibi that she and Jens had been in Washington, D.C. at the time of the murders. Since neither of the university students owned a car, they rented one and drove from Charlottesville to Washington, D.C. and back. Elizabeth explained that they just wanted to spend some time together, and while in D.C., they saw a couple of movies. As the weeks passed with no clues as to who had murdered the Haysoms, one detective was looking at his notes when the information about the rental car jumped out at him. With nothing left to lose, he contacted the rental car agency and got the information from the rental. Records showed that Elizabeth had rented a 1985 Chevy Chevette on March 29th, which had 19,404 miles on it. She returned it on March 31st with 20,073 miles on it. That meant they had driven 669 miles, which was much higher than they would have just driving to D.C. and back. A round trip from Washington, D.C. to Charlotte was 230 miles, 240 if you took the long route through Fredericksburg. That left about 430 miles, which meant they could have made the round trip almost 2 more times. There's no way they put that many miles on the car just driving around the city, as Jens would later claim. They would have to have spent most of the time they were in D.C. just driving around to build up that mileage. They could have left D.C. and gone somewhere else, though, so the detective did the math on a drive from Charlottesville to D.C., D.C. to Boonesboro, where the Haysom house was near Lynchburg, back to D.C., and then to Charlottesville. That worked out to be about 640 miles. That worked out perfectly, leaving them a reasonable 30 miles for driving around whichever city they were in. That's when Elizabeth was interviewed again. Detectives went to Charlottesville and spoke with her in the campus police office. They talked about some of the other things Elizabeth had done in the months before the murder, but when they got to March 31st, she agreed that she and Jens had driven to Washington, D.C. When the detective questioned the amount of miles they put on the rental, she claimed they had, quote, done a couple of things. Sensing that wasn't enough of an explanation, she also claimed they took a detour to Warrenton, which is on the way from Charlottesville to D.C. It wouldn't have added any miles to the trip. She claimed they got lost in Warrenton and drove around for a bit, but enough to add 400 miles? That's a solid 10 hours of driving at an average of 40 miles an hour. Like most of what came out of Elizabeth's mouth, it seemed unlikely. It was during that interview that the detectives asked about the relationship between Jens and her parents. Elizabeth said it was fine. She said that her parents had no problem with her and Jens dating. That would later be contradicted when her siblings testified that they actually couldn't stand the young man. When the detective brought up Nancy's first husband, Elizabeth took it as an opportunity to offer the investigators a new suspect. She claimed that he was probably in jail because he was involved in fraud. She also told the detective that he was abusive, had sexual relationships with men while married to Nancy, and had been biting chunks of flesh off of the children. She suggested they locate him and find out what he'd been doing. Of course, none of those details were true. Investigators wanted to interview Jens, but he remained elusive. He and Elizabeth went to Germany in the summer of 1985, and when they returned to Charlottesville, they moved into a house together with 2 other students. Detectives tried multiple times to get Jens to come in for an interview, but he was always busy. It took them until October of 1985 to finally get him to sit down and answer some questions. He parroted the story about being in Washington, D.C., and that he had no problems with Derek and Nancy. When they asked him about the extra miles on the car, he admitted that he didn't remember any other major trips, but that they did do a lot of driving around the city. When they asked if he would provide his fingerprints, footprints, and a blood sample, he refused. He literally told them that, since he was German, he didn't trust the police on account of how his grandfather had been treated by the Nazis. He told them that he wasn't convinced that handing over his blood and prints wouldn't have negative effects on himself and his family. At the end of the interview, he ended up telling the detectives that he wanted some time to think about it and that he would call them and let them know what he decided. Of course, that's when Jens and Elizabeth decided to run. In the middle of October of 1985, the couple flew to Europe. The suspects didn't just flee, they tried to make it as hard as possible to follow them. They flew separately to Paris a day apart, drove to Luxembourg, they took a train to Yugoslavia, they drove to Italy, then they made their way to Austria, where they flew to Thailand. Jens was under the impression that he could gain Thai citizenship since he was born there, but he was wrong. Realizing they wouldn't be able to get jobs in Thailand, they flew to Malaysia and from there to England. They were able to get some fake IDs while they were in Thailand, and they used them to open checking accounts. They would buy clothes with the checks and then return them for cash. They were able to sustain themselves for about 6 months, but on April 30th, 1986, Jens and Elizabeth were picked up by the police after a department store clerk became suspicious of their activity. Once the police looked through their apartment, they found their fake IDs as well as their real passports. They also found disguises and a large number of letters. Those letters had been written back and forth between Jens and Elizabeth and contained an overwhelming amount of talk about killing her parents. They talked about using hypnosis or voodoo to somehow will her parents into dying before the plan turned into them committing the crime themselves. Police in England made some calls to authorities in Virginia, and eventually they learned that Elizabeth's parents had in fact been murdered, and the 2 people they had in custody were the main suspects. When they sat down to interview Elizabeth, they showed her the letters that they had found amongst their belongings. Elizabeth had a lawyer with her in the interview, and she refused to answer any questions. When Jens was interviewed, he did not request a lawyer, and he ended up making a full confession. He told the authorities that he and Elizabeth had driven to Washington, D.C., and she stayed there, ordered room service, and went to the movies, having purchased 2 tickets to create the illusion that they were both there the entire time. He drove himself down to the Haysom house where he murdered Derek and Nancy. When detectives asked if Elizabeth knew what he was doing, he said yes. He said he arrived at the house and sat down with the couple, asking their permission to continue seeing Elizabeth. When Derek said no, he went into the kitchen, got a knife, and killed them. He gave them specific details about how each victim was killed and what had been on the dining room table at the time. He wouldn't allow the police to record his confession, but he did make an admission in writing. He said, quote, "I fell in love with a girl. We talked about killing her parents. I didn't want to do it, but I drove to their house and killed them, and I got caught." Once Jens had confessed, Elizabeth asked to speak to the detectives and told them she was equally as guilty. She said she knew what he was going to do and they had planned it together. The arrest of Elizabeth and Jens in England marked the beginning of a complex and protracted legal battle. On August 11, 1986, the United States formally requested the extradition of the pair based on the 1972 extradition treaty between the 2 countries. While Elizabeth did not fight extradition to Virginia, Jens took a different approach. He filed a petition for habeas corpus with a divisional court and requested permission for judicial review of the decision to commit him. Jens argued that the Extradition Act of 1870 did not permit extradition for a capital charge. Him having been the person who committed the murder, he was very likely going to be facing the death penalty. The extradition process became further complicated when Jens cited Article 4 of the US-UK extradition treaty. That article stipulates that an extradition request for a crime carrying the death penalty can be refused if the requesting country has not given assurances that the death penalty will not be carried out. Apparently, according to Jens, it's okay for him to carry out a death penalty, but not for one to be carried out on him. Despite those legal maneuvers, the British government approved Jens' extradition. However, that decision was not the end of the legal battle. Anticipating that outcome, Jens had filed a claim with the European Commission of Human Rights on July 9, 1988. He asserted that he would face inhumane and degrading treatment contrary to Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights if extradited to the US, given the likelihood of facing the death penalty. Again, stabbing and slicing two people's throats is okay for the Haysoms, but Jens deserves better treatment. This is the arrogance that people who knew him talked about. That legal battle would continue for years, ultimately leading to a landmark decision by the European Court of Human Rights in 1989. The court determined that the potentially lengthy process of awaiting execution in the United States were Jens to be convicted and sentenced to death would violate Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. As a result, Jens was only extradited to Virginia after the state agreed not to seek the death penalty. While Jens was fighting extradition, Elizabeth went to court and pleaded guilty of being an accessory before the fact in the murders of her parents. She offered her plea in such a quiet, British accented voice that the judge had to ask her to repeat it. The plea was tantamount to a conviction on 2 counts of first-degree murder, carrying a potential penalty of life imprisonment. Elizabeth's court-appointed lawyers had informed the Commonwealth's attorney in advance of her decision, but there had been no plea bargain arrangement or agreement on the sentence. Despite the guilty plea, the judge required the prosecution to present some of its evidence, including testimony from 2 Scotland Yard detectives who had questioned Elizabeth and Jens after their arrest in England. Elizabeth testified, claiming that she had seen the movie The Rocky Horror Picture Show, and when she got out of the movie, Jens was waiting for her. She said he was in the car wrapped in a sheet covered in blood. She testified that he told her then that he had killed her parents and that she hadn't known ahead of time what he was going to do, a different story than she had told earlier. Now she was claiming that it was a total shock to her. When they got back to the hotel, Jens took a shower and she went down and cleaned the blood out of the car. She claimed that, when she returned to the hotel room, he was asleep, so she also went to sleep. Of course, her claim that she had no idea that he was going to kill her parents was a complete contradiction to what the couple had written to each other about. Their own words described a pretty clear plan to end the life of her parents. In 1987, at the age of 23, Elizabeth Haysom was sentenced to 90 years in prison, one 45-year sentence for each murder to be served consecutively. By the time Jens returned to the U.S., his relationship with Elizabeth was over. She had written a letter to him prior to returning to Virginia where she broke up with him and told him she was going to accept her punishment and move on. Once back in Virginia, no longer Elizabeth's boyfriend, Jens recanted his confession. He claimed that Elizabeth was the true killer and that he had been trying to protect her. He asserted that he had only confessed to save Elizabeth from the electric chair, believing his status as a diplomat's son would result in a relatively brief sentence as a youth offender in Germany. His trial in 1990 took an unexpected turn when he pleaded not guilty. His defense team presented a theory that Elizabeth had committed the murders with one or more accomplices. The prosecution's case against Jens included type O blood found at the scene, which was the same blood type as the defendant, a bloody sock print that was the same size as Jens, and his multiple confessions including many accurate details of the crime scene. After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Jens Soering of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The trial drew international media attention and received gavel-to-gavel coverage on local cable television. In the years following his convictions, Jens appealed multiple times between 1990 and 1998, but state courts ruled against him every time. He then appealed in federal court, claiming ineffective assistance of counsel and that crucial evidence had not been shared during his trial. In 2000, the federal court also ruled against him, and eventually the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his case. A significant development occurred in 2009 when state-ordered DNA testing eliminated Jens from any of the blood samples found at the crime scene. That revelation was seen by Jens and his supporters as strong evidence supporting his claims of innocence. However, some experts say that the blood samples were not stored properly and might not have given accurate results. Also, the absence of someone's blood at the scene does not mean they aren't the killer. It's also important to point out that the majority of the blood found at the scene belonged to Nancy and Derek, with only small amounts of 2 other samples. The smaller amounts might not have been from the night of the murders. Then, a forensic podiatrist examined the footprint from the scene to Jens' foot and said it is remarkably similar. He noted that the splay of the first and second toe is identical. When Elizabeth first became eligible for parole in 1995, her family sent letters to the parole board. Her older half-brothers Howard and Richard opposed her release due to their belief that she was more involved in the murders than she claimed. Richard said he believes there was no way that his father would have let Jens in the house and let his guard down around him if Elizabeth hadn't been there with him. They also found that the Haysom's Canadian income tax return paperwork had been mailed from Washington, D.C. They believed that, before the attack, Derek and Nancy had asked Elizabeth to mail it, and she did so once they returned to D.C. They said they would never have given those documents to Jens. Richard said he mentioned the tax forms to Elizabeth when he came to Virginia for the funeral, and he said she freaked out. He said she was clearly shaken and began pacing around the room. They believe that both Elizabeth and Jens went to the Haysom home to commit the murder, and they had strategically placed a room service order and bought movie tickets to make it seem like they were in D.C. the entire time. Jens argues that it would have been impossible for them to have done that, but since they had an entire weekend, it remains unclear of the exact time of the murders. It's a large enough window that it's very possible they both were present for the murder. None of her siblings were in favor of her being paroled at that point, but they each believed she should be released at some point in the future. That would become a reality in November of 2019. Both Elizabeth and Jens were granted parole by the Virginia Parole Board. The decision was based on several factors, including their youth at the time of the offense, their institutional adjustment while incarcerated, and the amount of time served. However, their release came with a significant condition. Both Elizabeth and Jens were to be expelled from the United States and barred from ever returning. Elizabeth Haysom, then 55, was deported to Canada, where she held citizenship. Jens Soering, 53 at the time, was deported to Germany. Despite being free and back in his home country, Jens continues to fight for full exoneration. In the summer following his release, he sent a new pardon petition to Governor Glenn Youngkin, including new findings discovered since his last attempt. When questioned about his persistence in seeking a pardon despite being free, Jens emphasized the importance of clearing his name and addressing what he sees as a miscarriage of justice. In the years since his release, he has been on a non-stop campaign to try to convince the world of his innocence. He participated in the Netflix miniseries about the case, but has come out since claiming the documentary left out important details that prove his innocence. He has a YouTube channel where he posts videos non-stop about his innocence and the evidence that proves he's innocent. In one of the video titles, he calls Elizabeth a bitch, which seems quite childish and not a great way of trying to clear your name. I don't feel like Jens is any different from other arrogant murderers. They will go to their grave claiming they're innocent despite the likelihood that they are actually guilty. His confession, along with Elizabeth's admission and her accepting punishment for being involved, is pretty damning. In his own words, he wrote about killing Derek and Nancy. Jens has tried to claim that Elizabeth is the one who drove to her parents' house and murdered them while he stayed in DC to create an alibi, and of course that's possible. The cigarette butts found at the scene were the brand she smoked, but does that mean they were hers? Were they from that day? It was her parents' house, so finding her fingerprints, her hair, even her cigarette butts wouldn't be that strange. So again, it's possible, but would he deserve to have his name cleared if that was the case? He still planned a murder and helped create an alibi while knowing someone was committing that murder. No matter how Jens wants to twist the story, there's no way he comes out completely innocent. At the end of the day, it's most likely that he became obsessed with Elizabeth because she was his first sexual relationship and she was able to manipulate him into killing her parents. It's not an uncommon tale. That's my opinion based on his writings, his behavior when talking to the authorities, and his behavior after finding out they wanted his prints and blood. Then he confessed with too many accurate details. Sometimes you just need to call a duck a duck. Even after their release and deportation, the case continues to evolve, with Jens still fighting to clear his name. The ongoing controversy surrounding the infamous case serves as a reminder of the complexities within the criminal justice system. It also highlights the enduring public fascination with true crime stories and their ability to influence discussions about justice, truth, and redemption long after the initial events have taken place. Ultimately, both Elizabeth and Jens were involved in the murder. They planned it together and, at the least, one of them carried it out while the other created an alibi. No matter how you twist the story, they're both monsters. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.